Jonathan had always been curious about the past. When he inherited his grandmother's old, creaky house after her passing, he viewed it as an opportunity to reconnect with family history. The house, built in the early 1900s, was filled with relics from different eras. The attic was the last part of the house he chose to clean out, a cluttered, dusty space packed with antiques, forgotten heirlooms, and memories. Sunlight filtered through a small, grimy window, casting long shadows over piles of old books, furniture, and boxes draped in white sheets. The air was thick with dust, carrying the scent of age and decay. Jonathan's eyes fell on a small wooden chest hidden in the corner, partially buried under a stack of faded magazines. The chest was old and intricately carved, with its hinges rusted from time. After clearing the debris, he found a key nearby, tucked inside a faded handkerchief. A strange sense of anticipation filled him as he inserted the key into the lock. With a creak, the lid popped open, revealing its contents. An old porcelain doll, perfectly preserved. The doll was unlike any Jonathan had seen before. Its skin was flawless, with lifelike eyes and carefully painted features. Its hair was golden, tied back with a ribbon that had lost its vibrancy over the years. The doll wore a beautiful but worn dress, a style popular in the early 1900s. A chill ran down Jonathan's spine as he picked up the doll. It was heavier than he expected, and as he cradled it, he felt an unsettling sensation, almost like the doll was watching him. Its eyes seemed to glimmer in the dim light, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring right through him. He shook off the discomfort, chalking it up to his imagination. It was just a doll, an antique with some family history behind it. Ignoring the prickling sensation at the back of his neck, Jonathan decided to take the doll downstairs. As he carried it down the creaky attic steps, he felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the house itself was watching his every move. He set the doll on the mantel in the living room, intending to clean it up later and maybe display it as a family relic. But unbeknownst to him, this was the moment when the horrors would begin. That night, Jonathan lay in bed, unable to sleep. The house around him was quiet, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to fill the room like a dense fog. The events of the day played over in his mind, particularly the unsettling feeling he had when he found the doll. He turned over, trying to get comfortable, but an inexplicable sense of unease kept him wide awake. Around midnight, just as he was on the brink of sleep, he heard it, a faint whispering sound coming from somewhere in the house. Jonathan froze, his heart pounding. He held his breath, straining to hear. The whispers grew slightly louder, like a child's voice murmuring quickly, urgently. The sound seemed to echo through the hallway, filling it with a chilling presence. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Could someone be in the house? He forced himself to get out of bed, his legs trembling as he crept toward the door. His hand shook as he grasped the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the air cold and still. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that made his skin prickle. He glanced toward the living room, where he had left the doll. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast a sliver of light across the room. Jonathan squinted, trying to make out the doll's shape. There it was, sitting exactly where he had placed it on the mantel. But something was off. For a split second, it seemed as though the doll's head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it had turned to watch him. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly shut the door, retreating to his bed. He pulled the covers up to his chin, feeling like a child hiding from the monsters under the bed. "It's just your imagination," he whispered to himself, eyes fixed on the door. But as the minutes passed, he swore he could still hear faint, almost imperceptible whispers threading through the darkness. The next morning, Jonathan woke up feeling groggy and unsettled. He told himself that what he had heard the night before was just a bad dream, a figment of his imagination stirred by the creepiness of the old house. As he walked into the living room, however, he came to a halt. The doll was not on the mantel where he had left it. His eyes scanned the room, his heart pounding. There it was, now sitting on the coffee table in the middle of the room, its head turned toward the front door. A chill crept up his spine. How had it moved? He was the only one in the house. and he had locked the doors and windows before going to bed. Was he sleepwalking? Or was someone playing a cruel prank on him? Pushing down his growing fear, Jonathan approached the doll cautiously. Its eyes seemed to sparkle in the morning light, an unsettling glint that made his stomach turn. He picked it up with a trembling hand, feeling the cold porcelain against his skin. It was just a doll, he reminded himself, a lifeless object. Yet, holding it made his skin crawl. He placed it back on the mantel, positioning it carefully as if that would somehow prevent it from moving again. All day, he tried to go about his business, cleaning the house and sorting through more of his grandmother's belongings. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he passed the living room, he glanced at the doll, expecting to see it somewhere else. It remained on the mantel, staring blankly ahead. As the day wore on, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered in the hallway, doors creaked open on their own, and objects seemed to move just out of the corner of his eye. Each time he checked, nothing was out of place, except the doll. By evening, he found it on the arm of the sofa, its head tilted upward as if it were watching something on the ceiling. Panic surged through him as he picked it up again. How was this happening? He placed it back on the mantel, his hands shaking. By the time night fell, Jonathan was on edge. He locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, and retreated to his bedroom, leaving the doll alone in the darkened living room. But as he lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before, threading through the stillness of the house like a sinister lullaby. In the days that followed, Jonathan noticed that the strange occurrences around the house were intensifying. The temperature fluctuated wildly, with some rooms feeling like iceboxes while others grew stiflingly warm. Jonathan would find objects out of place. Books that he had neatly stacked were now strewn across the floor, picture frames tilted or knocked over. The most unsettling was the doll, which continued to move despite his efforts to leave it. Undisturbed, desperate for answers, Jonathan decided to dig into the history of the doll. He scoured his grandmother's belongings for clues, searching through boxes of old photographs, letters, and records. After hours of sorting through yellowed papers, he found a photograph that made his heart skip a beat. It was a picture of a young girl, no older than 8, holding the very same doll. Her face was solemn, her eyes staring into the camera with a haunting intensity. On the back of the photograph, a name was written in delicate cursive, Margaret, 1925. Jonathan's curiosity turned to dread as he searched for more information. After scouring through old family documents, he stumbled upon an article from a local newspaper. It described a tragic accident that took place nearly a century ago. Margaret was the daughter of the house's original owners. She had died in mysterious circumstances, and the article hinted at rumors of strange events in the house even before her death. As he delved further into the research, Jonathan found references to a doll, a cherished possession of Margaret's, said to have been her only comfort during her illness. There were whispers among the townsfolk that Margaret's spirit had become attached to the doll, trapping her within its porcelain frame. Jonathan felt a chill as he realized the implications. The doll he had found in the attic was more than just a toy. It was a vessel, a prison holding the spirit of a restless, tormented child. That evening, Jonathan sat across from the doll, staring into its glassy eyes. "Margaret, what do you want?" he whispered, almost expecting a response. The room grew cold, and the air thickened with a sense of unease. The doll remained still, its expression unchanging, but the whispering began again, filling his ears with the frantic murmur of a child's voice. His heart pounded, and he felt a surge of fear. The doll didn't just want to be seen. It wanted to control. As the days passed, Jonathan found it increasingly difficult to ignore the doll's growing presence. It seemed to be everywhere, its porcelain face turning up in places he had never put it. One morning, he awoke to find it sitting at the foot of his bed, its lifeless eyes fixed on him. The sight made his blood run cold. He knew he had left the doll in the living room the night before. The whispers grew louder and more demanding. He began hearing his name, spoken in a child's voice, echoing through the hallways and rooms. At first, he tried to block it out, telling himself it was all in his head. But the voice grew more insistent, filling his mind with thoughts and emotions that weren't his own. "Help me, Play with me. Make it stop. The words filled him with dread, a sense that he was being drawn into something dark and unexplainable. The doll's influence began to take a toll on Jonathan's daily life. He started losing time, finding himself in different parts of the house with no memory of how he got there. Once, he woke up sitting in front of the fireplace, the doll cradled in his arms, humming a lullaby he had never learned. Panic gripped him as he realized that the doll was not just haunting him, it was trying to possess him. Determined to break free from the doll's control, Jonathan decided to confront it directly. That night, he set the doll on the mantel and sat in front of it, his eyes locked on its expressionless face. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered. In the silence that followed, a single whisper cut through the air. "You?" Jonathan staggered back, his mind reeling. The doll wanted more than a companion. It wanted a body, a vessel through which it could live again. And it was willing to take him if he didn't find a way to stop it. Jonathan tried to ignore the doll, leaving it untouched on the mantel, but its presence grew stronger. The whispers became a constant background noise, filling the house with an atmosphere of unease. He felt a persistent coldness in the air, no matter how high he turned up the heat. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways, as if reaching out toward him. Objects continued to move on their own. Books fell off shelves, chairs slid across the floor, and mirrors cracked without explanation. The doll appeared in new places every day. The kitchen table, the bathroom counter, his bedroom dresser. Each time he found it, its head seemed to be angled differently, as though it were watching him from every corner of the house. Jonathan's friends began to notice a change in him. He grew pale, his eyes hollow with sleepless nights spent listening to the doll's whispers. He isolated himself, fearing that whatever was haunting him might affect others. Every time he tried to reach out for help, the doll's voice would echo in his mind, filling him with a sense of hopelessness. One night, he awoke to find himself standing in the hallway, the doll clutched in his hands. Horror washed over him as he realized he had no memory of how he got there. The whispers grew louder, pounding against his skull. "You belong to me now," they chanted, over and over. In that moment, he understood that the doll was gaining control over him, pushing him closer to the brink of possession. Desperate, Jonathan reached out to an old friend, Emily, who had a deep interest in the paranormal. She was skeptical at first, but when she heard the tremor in Jonathan's voice, she agreed to visit the house. When Emily arrived, the atmosphere inside was oppressive, the air heavy with a sense of malevolence. She immediately noticed the doll on the mantel, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. "This is not just a haunted object," she said, her voice low and tense. "It's a conduit. The spirit within it is trying to manifest, and it's using you as a means to do so." Jonathan shuddered, feeling the doll's presence more strongly than ever. Emily set up a circle of salt around the doll and began preparing for a ritual to confront the spirit within. As Emily began to chant, the house shook, and the air grew colder. The shadows along the walls twisted violently, forming into shapes that resembled distorted faces. Jonathan watched in horror as the doll's eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and the whispers erupted into a cacophony of voices, screaming and crying out in anguish. Jonathan sat within the protective circle, staring at the doll as Emily continued to chant. The doll trembled, its porcelain face cracking in places as a thick mist began to seep from its seams. From within the mist, a figure took shape, a young girl with hollow eyes and a mouth that moved soundlessly. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as the room filled with an overwhelming sorrow. "Margaret, show yourself," Emily commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. The figure's form solidified, and Jonathan felt a wave of emotions crash over him. Fear, anger, and an unbearable loneliness. The spirit stared at him, its eyes wide and pleading. "What do you want?" Jonathan shouted, his voice breaking. The girl's eyes glowed with a fiery intensity as she whispered, "Freedom. Through you." The room shook violently, and the doll's limbs jerked erratically on the mantel. Emily threw salt water onto the doll, chanting louder, The spirit screamed, a high-pitched wail that filled the room and rattled the windows. Jonathan felt a force pressing against his chest, as though the doll were trying to pull him into itself. With a surge of willpower, he shouted, "No, you cannot have me." The shadows recoiled, and the room fell into a heavy silence. The spirit's form flickered and then dissolved back into the doll, which lay motionless within the salt circle. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. Jonathan collapsed, gasping for breath. Emily continued her ritual, sealing the doll within the circle. The house groaned one last time, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. The doll twitched, its eyes dimming as the light within faded. "The spirit is bound," Emily said, her voice tired but resolute. "But it's still in there. We need to lock it away, where it can't reach anyone again." Jonathan nodded, feeling both relief and fear. The struggle wasn't over. The doll still held the spirit, but at least for now, its power was contained. Together, they wrapped the doll in heavy cloth, sealing it inside a wooden box that Emily had prepared with protective symbols. They carried the box to the attic and placed it in the farthest corner, where shadows lingered but could no longer move of their own will. As they locked the attic door, Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The whispers had ceased, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Days turned into weeks. ###10. Sealing the doll away, continued, Jonathan finally felt peace return to the house. He and Emily secured the wooden box inside a heavy chest, which they lined with protective sigils and covered with a thick, dust-covered cloth. They placed the chest in the furthest corner of the attic, behind old furniture and forgotten relics, ensuring it would remain untouched. Emily marked the attic door with symbols meant to seal off the doll's influence, muttering incantations to prevent the spirit from escaping. With the task complete, Jonathan closed the attic door and locked it, feeling a sense of finality. The house grew warmer, and the oppressive energy that had filled it dissipated, leaving behind an eerie calm. Days turned into weeks, and Jonathan slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The whispers ceased, and he no longer experienced the unsettling movements or the presence that had haunted him. Though he knew the doll still existed within the attic, bound and sealed, it no longer held power over him. Its curse had been contained, and the spirit of Margaret was trapped within the porcelain shell once more. Occasionally, he would hear faint creaks from the attic above, but he learned to ignore them, choosing to live in the present rather than dwell on the dark history lurking in the shadows. If this tale of the Whispering Doll sent chills down your spine, be sure to hit subscribe for more terrifying stories like this one. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest haunting tales. Have you ever encountered a cursed object or experienced something paranormal? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up to let us know. Remember, some things are best left locked away.